So learning target 5.1, describe the main structural features of the epidermis and explain their functional significance. We want to understand what the cells are doing, what they're going through at each stage. All right, so moving on here, we're going to start with the deepest layer of the excuse me, epidermis. And the deepest layer is called the stratum germinativum. So what I gave you as a vocab word, germinaire, to start growing, sounds like a German airline or something. Um, it's there already now. So another name for that, by the way, is the stratum basale, which I put on the board because I can't write on my Google Slides. Apparently, you can't write on the smart board with Google Slides, so I got to figure that out. But it's also known as the stratum basale. Again, it's on the chalkboard, so you recognize that those two terms, stratum basale and stratum germinativum, are interchangeable. They mean the same thing. This is going to be the deepest layer of the epidermis. I'm going to go back for a minute. I'll come back to the slide, so don't worry. And so since I can't write on here on the video, it's probably not going to make sense. But if I see the wavy line kind of towards the surface there between where it's the lighter material that makes up the dermis, that wavy line is a good line to distinguish between the outermost layer, the epidermis, and the dermis. While the bottommost layer you see there of these kind of darker purple cells, this is actually the stratum germinativum or stratum basale. So we have large stem cells. Stem cells are cells that divide and turn into other things, other types of cells. These stem cells are going to turn into new skin cells, mainly these things called keratinocytes. And these new cells that are made are going to gradually get pushed towards the surface of the skin. We also have things called melanocytes here. Have you guys ever heard of anything that sounds like melanocyte? Melanin, yeah. Melanin is a dark pigment. Regardless of our skin color, we all have approximately the same number of melanocytes. But people that have darker skin, that means that their melanocytes produce more melanin. People with lighter skin produce less. People in between, like me, end up with kind of bronze skin. All right, so the next three layers as we're going toward the surface, we're just going to call the intermediate strata. These layers in order from deepest moving up would be the strata. What does strata mean, by the way? You guys have seen a similar word when we did epithelial tissue. Like stratified means more than one what? layers, okay? So that's what strata means, is layer. Tell them that when you order one next time. I'm sure they would know. Okay, from the spinosum. These are spiny cells, by the way, when they're actually prepared, when they're stained for observing. They kind of shrink and get a spiny appearance. Um, Another thing I wanted to point out from that diagram, if I can go back for a second again, is that when you look at the epidermis and you notice that bottom layer of the wave, those cells don't look very flattened. Okay, and remember that when we talked about epithelial tissue and we talked about skin is an example of stratified squamous cells, right? So stratified, more than one layer. Squamous means flattened. So as we work towards the surface, like if we look at the next layer, this is actually the stratum spinosum. I wish I could write on here. Stratum spinosum, and those still aren't really flattened. But as we get up to the next layer, this is actually the stratum granulosum. As I'm going towards the top, it's the last dark layer before the yellowish final layer. But now the cells are starting to flatten out, okay, before we get to the stratum corneum. Now, the other layer that was listed on your notes, you might not have it written down yet, but it was the stratum lucidum. And the stratum lucidum is only found in what is referred to as thick skin. So there's actually an extra layer of the epidermis there. This would be like the palms of the hands, the soles of the feet, but not in this picture. So in this picture, we have the bottom row is the stratum germinativum or basale, and then we have the stratum spinosum, and then we have the granulosum, and then we have the corneum. So this word you see there with a K, keratin, very important word. You need to get used to seeing that. Keratin is a tough, fibrous protein. You're going to come across another word in this chapter called keratin with a C. You've got to understand that those are different things. Okay? Keratin with a C, like carrot, is an orange pigment. Keratin with a K is a tough, fibrous protein. So you've got to be able to distinguish between those two. Now, when we start out at the lowest layer, the deepest layer, the germinativum, we're not having this keratin produced at all. It's actually going to start getting produced at the upper layers of the spinosum and more so in the granulosum. Okay? Now, so these cells are, as this keratin's being produced, it's kind of accumulating in the cells. Because of this, if you think about cells and their normal functions to exist and divide and do things, in the case of skin cells, that is not what they're there for. In the case of skin cells, they're there to die, really, to be tough and to die, because as they go towards the surface, we mainly want to have a protective layer, and that's what the cells end up being. So by the time they get to the top layer, have you guys written all this down? By the time we get to the top layer, the stratum corneum, the cells are fully keratinized. The other thing to think about, so they're being packed with keratin, and that's going to help kill them off. Do you guys remember what vascular means? What does vascular mean? Where have you heard vascular before? Cardiovascular, and what does that stand for? Cardio means heart, and vascular means, yeah, blood vessels. Okay? So arteries too. All right, so blood vessels. Now, you probably or may not have noticed from that diagram that I showed, but the dermis is vascular. It has blood vessels. but the epidermis is avascular without blood vessels. Okay? So now blood vessels, they need to move things around our body, get it to cells so they have nutrients and take away waste. But as these cells move up farther from the dermis, they're moving farther from their nutrient source. So that's another factor in why they're dying. And by the time they get to the surface, they are fully keratinized, packed full of this tough, fibrous protein to protect us, and waterproof as well. And then they get up that top layer, and this process from the bottom layer, the germinativum, to the top takes about 4 to 5 weeks. When they get up to the top, they're eventually going to come off. This is a very large part of the dust in your home. So you're cleaning the dust, getting dust on yourself. That's really a lot of dead skin cells from you and your family and anybody else who's been in your house. Yummy. All right. You guys good with that? No? So this kind of the formatting got switched around when I switched to Google Slides, but I'm really just putting them in order for you to kind of picture. So the outermost layer being the stratum corneum, stratum lucidum under that if it's thick skin, stratum granulosum under that, stratum spinosum under that, and then the bottom layer, the stratum germinativum or basale. You should be able to list them in order. Come, let's get sunburned is a mnemonic device. I was trying to come up with something mnemonic device, and I just got lazy and looked online, and they had that one, and I said, sure. CLGSB, corneum, lucidum, granulosum, spinosum, basale. Yeah, should write that down. Shouldn't take long. So the outermost layer, stratum corneum, the three intermediate strata, the lucidum, the granulosum, and the spinosum, and the deepest layer, the germinativum or basale. Come, let's get sunburned. Which is not really a good idea. It's not good for you. Not healthy. The one is stratum granulosum, but granulosum got pushed to the next line. This is pretty much it with the notes. I do have just a couple diagrams I wanted to just show you just to kind of clarify what I was talking about earlier with the shapes of the cells and how they're changing, and an overall picture. So this is what I was talking about earlier. The basale at the bottom, this one layer down here. And then above that, we have the spinosum, still not flattened cells. See the nuclei in the cells easily. That's another distinction that you can tell between the basale and the spinosum. And then when you get to the granulosum, you'll see less of the nuclei in there because the cell's getting packed full of that keratin. And then lucidum if it's thick skin, and then the corneum, which are dead or almost dead cells. Okay? And this is the overall picture of skin, just where the epidermis. So it's important to remember we're just talking about the top layer of the skin, the epidermis. So we have epidermis, below that dermis, and then we have hypodermis, also known as the subcutaneous layer, meaning technically under the skin. And then what we're talking about today, just to keep things straight, we're just talking about layers within that outermost layer, within the epidermis. Okay? And that's the end of the notes for today. Bleep, bleep, bleep. That's all, folks.